You're in the kitchen.
All right, welcome to another kitchen conversation where today we are going to talk about hydration. As you know, as pickleball players, we need to stay hydrated, but maybe drinking a whole bunch of water isn't good enough. Today I have an expert in hydration, Dr. James Dinicolantonio. Did I get that right?
Yes, Dinicolantonio. Yep.
Dinicolantonio. Welcome to Kitchen Conversation. Thanks for joining us. Tell us a little bit about your background. You have a study in cardiovascular
Health.
I'm going to butcher it. Just tell me what tell me your background and how you became an expert in both hydration and sodium in particular.
So as it pertains to salt and hydration, I did wrestle in high school. I ran cross country. I sort of kind of understood the importance of, salt and electrolytes and hydration, but not to the level of when it comes to sort of population guidance and how much we should be consuming and how much is actually lost on average when we sweat. And that obviously depends on the person, the environment, what type of physical activity they're doing. But I've published over 300 research papers, a lot pertaining to salt, several books pertaining to salt and hydration. And a lot of it's also stemmed from when I was a community pharmacist dealing with a lot of people that were placed on low salt diets by their doctors, and then they just ended up feeling terrible. They would go to their doctor, they would get their sodium levels tested, they'd all be low, and as soon as they started adding salt back to their diet, they started feeling better. So salt is kind of one of those things where everyone kind of thinks it's a poison, but it's actually an essential mineral, and we kind of forget how quickly we can lose it. It's actually the most most prevalent, let's call it essential mineral that can be lost very quickly, either through sweat or through caffeine coffee intake out the urine, or you can start losing it having diarrhea, things like that. So we can lose it really quickly, and when we don't get it in the diet, and especially if we're eating like a whole food diet, since we're no longer consuming like the salty blood and interstitial fluid of the animal, the whole foods are now very low in salt. So it's just something that a lot of athletes and a lot of people are eating clean. When they start adding it back to their diet, they start to feel a lot better.
Got it. So I didn't even realize that you could lose it from coffee. I drink a lot of coffee, and I bet you that's part of the reason why I was losing as much sodium as I was. In the way that I came to find you, and let me just plug your book here for a second. When it's academic-ish. It's a heavy read, but it's really interesting. And I've been geeking out about why sodium is so important to hydration. And we can geek out about that in a second. But I found you because I found this salt, product, ReLyte, which you know about because it all kind of came full circle. I reached out to them, they reached out back to me, and they told me about your book. I was reading your book, and they knew you. So it was kind of this magical intersection. By getting all these electrolytes in, I want to figure out, what are electrolytes? Why are they important? Is sodium an electrolyte? And how do they all work together when we are hydrating?
So an electrolyte is essentially like a charged mineral in the blood. So once it dissolves, it has a charge. But when it comes to hydration, you have outside of the cell hydration, which is the primary electrolyte would be sodium. And then inside the cell hydration, the two primary electrolytes would be magnesium and potassium. And the reason is because they are osmotically active, meaning they actually bring water with them. So potassium and magnesium bring water into the cell. Sodium brings water outside of the cell into our blood. So they're all three of those are the primary, let's call them hydration minerals, which is the most prevalent minerals in ReLyte, which makes sense. But really the key one is sodium and chloride, aka salt, because we lose a lot more salt than we do potassium or magnesium when we sweat. And so, it's just starting to come out that, electrolytes should actually have a higher salt content compared to like Gatorade, which really only has about 1/10 of the sodium that you actually need if you are a heavy sweater.
Yeah, and lots of sugar, obviously, in Gatorade. And I drink Gatorade for years, and I tried to cut out sugars out of my beverage consumption, and that's kind of how I ended up in the world of ReLyte, because no sugar added. And then I found out the importance of sodium. And here's one of the things that I realized when I started drinking the ReLyte was that when I was a kid, I used to sweat a lot, but I would lick my lips from the sweat and I would taste salt. And I probably hadn't had that experience in 30 years. And when I started drinking ReLyte, I would be playing pickleball and I would lick my lips and I would taste salt. And I was like, it brought me back to being a kid again. I was like, I forgot that's how it used to taste. And I think I just had depleted my sodium and my salt intake so much just from diet, trying to eat healthier, that I had no salt in my system. And I think that was affecting my ability to hydrate because I just drank straight water. But keeping a low sodium diet and then just drinking water, it really doesn't effectively get the electrolytes back into your bloodstream. Do I have that accurate?
Yeah, so essentially, salt is what allows our body, particularly sodium, to actually absorb and retain the water that we consume. So you really don't want pure, clear urine because that means that you're just peeing out pure water. You want it to be just light yellow is actually typically more hydrated than pure water or your urine being purely clear for that reason. And the thing is you lose on average about a half a teaspoon of salt per hour of exercise, and that will increase as the intensity of exercise increases and as the ambient temperature increases. So tennis players have been known to lose 6,000 milligrams of sodium per hour if they are playing in the heat. And so, you have a 4 to 6 hour match and you can start losing 20, 30 grams of sodium in that match. And so that can lead to muscle cramps, which happens all the time. Even in, elite tennis players, this happens. They're not getting their electrolytes correct. And so what's really interesting too is that most people try to match hydration with the concentration of salt in their sweat. So a lot of people, let's say you lose 2,000 milligrams of sodium and you've lost, let's say, a liter of fluid. A lot of people will think that you should just consume the 2,000 milligrams of sodium in the liter of fluid to get back, right, what you lost. And that intuitively makes sense, but it's actually not the best way to hydrate because if you think about it, if you go to the hospital, they don't give you something that's that dilute, 2,000 milligrams per liter. They give you normal saline, which is 3,500 milligrams of sodium per liter. So you really want to match the saltiness of your blood when you're trying to replenish what's been lost to then get your blood volume back up to where it should be.
And where do you break down between pre-hydration and rehydration? I've been trying to drink as much sodium before I go out and play so I don't lose it all, and then I'm trying to get it back, and I feel like it's a losing battle for me at least.
Yeah, and so really I've tried to spearhead a couple points on hydration. The two biggest that most people aren't talking about is number one, the best hydration is pre-hydration. Because once you start vigorously exercising, gastric emptying starts decreasing. And so it's hard to get fluid into the body when you are vigorously exercising. It just sits in the stomach. That's why you get bloated, and that can lead to things like cramping and performance going down if you're trying to overhydrate while you're vigorously performing exercise because gastric emptying has gone down. So that's one key is pre-hydrating 90 minutes prior to, let's say, competition with a salt solution that's as salty as your blood, somewhere around 3,000 to 3,500 milligrams of sodium per liter. And this needs to be in a palatable solution. You can't just take real salt and pour it in water at that concentration and think you're going to be able to handle it. It has to have some type of flavor, which ReLyte does, which is why that's a great product to use. But getting all of that ahead of the problem, ahead of vigorous exercise, starting 90 minutes prior, slowly consuming it over 30 minutes, will allow your body to slowly expand blood volume and you'll really be ready to go before competition. That being said, the other point that I've been trying to spearhead too is dehydration acclimation, which is basically you're not pre-hydrating prior to practice. So so we're going to separate competition where you want to pre-hydrate with a salt solution as salty as blood. And then the other factor is training. How should you hydrate when you're training? You're going to do basically the complete opposite. You want to practice what's called dehydration acclimation. essentially where you induce mild episodes of dehydration, which will signal your body to retain more salt and expand blood volume. And so that basically you're triggering a hormetic response where if you induce small amounts of dehydration multiple times in a row, you end up expanding baseline blood volume and you become more of a salt retainer. And then prior to competition is when you hit yourself with that really nice, high salt load, so you're ready to go. So you still want to come into training fully hydrated or euhydrated, but just not boosted up. You don't want the blood volume boosted up too much because you want to actually induce mild dehydration and get all the benefits of dehydration acclimation.
Okay, so is it better to be hydrating pre-hydration with more water than something with electrolytes and sodium?
As long as you keep the sodium content to, let's say, 1,000 milligrams or less, you're really not going to boost blood volume and prevent, let's say, the adaptive benefits.
Okay.
So you can have, if you want to make sure you hydrated before exercise, 1 scoop of ReLyte's 800 milligrams of sodium essentially, so that would be okay. But you start going above 1,000, you can start expanding blood volume, and then you're playing better. You're going to feel a lot better, but you aren't going to get the benefits, and you're not going to play as good later on. So it's like you're training low to perform high 2 weeks later, so to speak.
So things that I've noticed, and tell me I might be way off base and I might just be making these correlations in my head, but pickleball is a sport that requires a lot of focus, right? It's not just a physical sport, but mental focus. Yeah. And you tend to lose focus, you lose a few points in a row. Next thing you know, you kind of snap out of it and you're like, oh, there's a running joke of what's the score? You just forget things when you're playing because you get in this kind of zone. And I found myself 100% zoning out. And I blame that on my lack of hydration. And I found that as I started introducing sodium, I had a lot more clarity. And I was limiting that time where I would just zone out for a moment. Is that accurate? Is that something to do physically with sodium getting into my bloodstream?
Yeah, 100%. So there's two things kind of going on here. One is that, yes, you need sodium for nerve, function and basically nerve firing. And you need good blood circulation as well to the brain. And so when you're vigorously exercising, you have competition of blood flow between the heart, between the working skeletal muscle, the organs, and then the skin, which is trying to increase blood flow to dump heat. So you have a reduction in blood flow to the brain, and that will absolutely decrease mental acuity. But if you can, if you're properly hydrated, which requires sodium and water, then that will absolutely improve mental focus and cognition and acuity. And this has been shown in many studies, just being dehydrated even less than 2%, like 1.8%, will decrease mental acuity.
And you mentioned heat, and that was one of the things I took from your book, of that the body will begin to overheat. And even just a little bit of overheating really has a really detrimental effect on your ability to perform. How can I measure how much, how hot I am? Obviously, I sweat a ton. I feel like I'm always overheating. Yeah. Is there any, does a Whoop, does that measure heat? I wear my, my Apple Watch, but that's not giving me any index.
No, so the studies will, I ironically, unfortunately, use rectal thermometers. That's really the only way to accurately do it.
Out of the question.
But you'll know, you can just feel, you'll be sweating, you'll know that you're overheated. Another key benefit is that when you prehydrate with salt water, if you prehydrate with cold salt water, slightly colder than refrigeration temperature, so anywhere from 37 to 39 degrees Fahrenheit, if you consume about a liter of that or even 3/4 of a liter of that salt solution, you will drop core body temperature by at least a half a degree. So that will increase how long you can perform in the heat because it's going to take you longer to hit a critical core temperature that will start inhibiting your performance. Because the more fluid that you have in you, the greater that the heat can go into it. So basically water has, it's a substance that it takes a lot of energy to actually heat water versus other substances. And so when you have more fluid in your body, especially cold fluid, that will drop core temperature and it will increase the time it takes for your body to hit a critical core temp.
Okay, this is gonna take us off into a little segue, but I have to ask because I lived in Asia for 12 years, and the Chinese basically believe that warm water will cool you down. And so when you're hot and sweaty, they offer you a nice warm glass of water. And it drove me crazy because I need ice cold water, which was not a very prevalent accommodation. Is that right? Is there any science behind having warm water to cool down your core?
No, not at all. It's the complete opposite. So, I mean, if you think about it, the body is 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. If you're drinking water that is, let's say, 37 to 39 Fahrenheit, that's going to drop core body temperature, especially if you bring in enough fluid and enough volume to do that. And so the studies are very clear. 39 Fahrenheit water, which is just under refrigeration temperature. So refrigeration temperature is 40 to 46. So the studies have typically used 39, but even going slightly lower will probably be even better, will drop core temperature as long as you're consuming about at least 3/4 of a liter of fluid.
Okay. All right. I'll buy that. It never made sense to me, and I will stick to what my body was telling me. What's the relationship? Like, let me ask it a different way. How does salt play the balance with all the other electrolytes? And what's the importance of salt or sodium, or is it sodium and chloride? What is the actual mineral, and how does it play such a vital role with everything else?
So salt is made up of two minerals, sodium and chloride. Chloride makes up hydrochloric acid. Chloride is what's secreted by immune cells to kill pathogens. It's called hypochlorous acid. Chlorine, tauramine is made of chloride, which is secreted by the immune cells to calm inflammation. It's a combination of taurine plus chloride. So that's the chloride part of salt. And then sodium is the hydration part of salt. So salt is made of two minerals, two essential minerals. And the sodium is what basically allows our blood volume to expand, allows us to have a good blood circulation, blood flow to the organs when we exercise. It allows us to have a blood pressure, which is needed for life. And so that's what it's composed of, and those are some of its functions.
Okay. And then when you lose electrolytes through sweat, and then we replace them with straight water, right? Cold water, which is what I used to drink all the time when I was out playing for hours at a time. What's happening to my body? Is it not being replenished with the minerals it needs? But I get the feeling of water and replenishment, but is my body fighting for more?
Well, so there's a few things that can happen, especially in long endurance exercise, particularly lasting over 4 hours. You can cause what's called hyponatremia, or low sodium levels in the blood, which can kill you. That's the extreme, right? And then at the other end of the spectrum is what's very common, muscle cramps from not replacing the electrolytes. So both magnesium and sodium are the two most important when it comes to muscle cramps, but even potassium and calcium can play a role too. But it's when it comes to actual exercise, in particular exercises in the heat, definitely sodium is the number one mineral that induces muscle cramps. And there's been many studies giving salt tablets to, even going back to the 1920s and 30s, to factory workers in the heat versus factory workers that weren't given salt tablets. There was a 10-fold higher incidence of muscle cramps. And so we know that salt is important for preventing that. Besides low sodium levels, besides muscle cramps, we know that just electrically induced muscle cramps are increased when you're just consuming plain water. Plain water does tend to flush out potassium more than sodium, so it will increase the loss of potassium out the urine. But when you don't get enough sodium, the body will pull it from the bone to try to maintain a normal sodium level in the blood. But there's these little cells called osteoclasts that will strip the bone to get the sodium. Mm-hmm. They're not specific though for sodium. They'll also pull calcium and magnesium from the bone. And it'll spike calcium and magnesium in the blood, and your body will think you're actually high in calcium and magnesium, and then it'll kick it out in the urine. So when you don't get enough salt, not only are you depleting your sodium levels, but you're also going to strip your bone of calcium and magnesium.
Why do you think salt got such a bad rap for so long? I feel like it was the enemy, and now it feels like it's having a resurgence, if you will. It feels like we're finding out that maybe it's not all that bad.
One, we forgot that we consumed the whole animal, which included the salty blood, the interstitial fluid, that we would seek out animal trails and directly consume salt licks. that we would consume brackish water and salty water. So that started to stem from the Paleolithic guys like Eaton and Cordain and all that, and thinking that we evolved on this very, very low sodium diet when they would never take into account the full animal and the full salt in the full animal. So that's one. So from let's say, call it a prehistoric intake, we got it wrong. Number two, we focus just on blood pressure and not actually on hard clinical outcomes like strokes, heart attacks, deaths. When you actually look at the hard outcomes, a low salt intake is associated with a higher risk of those. And the fact that in 90% of the cases of people who are salt sensitive and regarding their blood pressure, that if you just increase their exercise, you increase their magnesium or potassium intake, or you reduce their refined carbs and sugar intake, you're going to eliminate the salt sensitivity in 9 out of 10 cases. So it's not don't blame the salt for what the processed foods or the lack of magnesium and potassium has done.
Right. Got it. And so what about, I see people looking for solutions out on the pickleball court, and you have a pretty savvy group of people that have been around the block. It skews a little bit older. And people I see with mustard packets, drinking pickle juice. Obviously, pickle juice is high in sodium. Mustard, I'm not sure. Is mustard filled with salt?
No, they're probably using that for maybe the vinegar, and the acetic acid, which can release glycine, which has been shown to reduce muscle cramps. But I don't think that the mustard really will have any type of real benefit. The pickle juice will. There's actually been at least 2 studies that pickle juice can abort a muscle cramp within 30 to 90 seconds. So if you're having a muscle cramp due to, salt-induced, spasms, salt deficit, then consuming pickle juice, just 2 to 3.5 ounces, has been shown to stop a muscle cramp within 30 seconds.
And what's the science behind that? Like, how is that happening that fast? How is that getting into our bloodstream that quickly?
Yeah, they think it's actually the acetic acid in the pickle juice that releases glycine, which is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, which is why it happens so quickly.
Okay. Acetic acid, is that what you said? Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
What else is acetic acid in? Where else could we find that?
You could find acetic acid in apple cider vinegar at a probably much higher concentration than in pickle juice. And probably I would say lemon juice might have acetic acid too at a lower concentration.
Okay. And so when I'm out on the courts and I'm playing, and this goes for everybody, how do I know that I'm low on my electrolytes? Is there a symptom? Is there something I should be looking at and looking for to be able to kind of monitor where I am?
It's a great question. And it's something that I've struggled with too. Like, is there one surrogate marker to, above the all of all of them? And there really isn't. It's sort of, taking multiple things into consideration. And there isn't one. I mean, just going through some of them would be low blood volume would be one. So you can't really directly measure that unless you have a Swan-Ganz catheter. So the next best thing is looking at hematocrit percentage. So if you have a high percentage of hematocrit, that typically means you have a low blood volume. Your blood cells are highly compact compared to the fluid. So that's probably one of the best measurements is, do you have a high hematocrit or not? Because that's a decent indication, as long as there's not blood loss, of blood volume. So when you think about, do I have a lot of salt? You don't necessarily want to measure sodium, which is kind of counterintuitive. You'd be like, well, geez, if my sodium levels are low, then I must be low in salt. That can be the case, but it also can be that you are overhydrated with plain water and you dropped your sodium. So it doesn't necessarily mean you actually have low salt per se. Although taking salt when you have low sodium is obviously extremely important. So that is another surrogate marker. So you have hematocrit for the blood volume measurement, which is, in my opinion, a better way to measure if you have enough salt or not, is if you have good blood volume. On top of that, you look at sodium levels as well to see, okay, what's going on there as well, which can give you another indicator. And then blood urea nitrogen is another good indicator. If that is high, that's usually an indicator of also low blood volume, as long as there's not kidney dysfunction, because that's sort of like an indicator of blood flow to the kidney.
Got it. So when I'm taking my ReLyte, like, how would you prepare to play 2 hours of pickleball in the hot sun and heat, would you be taking an hour before taking the 800 milligrams, or 1 scoop of ReLyte, and then throughout you'd have another one, maybe two?
So if I wanted to acutely boost my performance, and I wasn't trying to do dehydration acclimation, I wanted to play really solid for those 2 hours, I would personally want to cover 2,000 milligrams of sodium per hour. So I would probably take around 4,000 milligrams of sodium in about a full liter of fluid coming from the ReLyte. So ReLyte's 800, so that means I would do about 5 scoops of ReLyte in a full liter of ice cold water, and I would start consuming that probably 105 minutes to 120 minutes before, and slowly consume that over 30 minutes or so.
And you think that would be over that 1 liter? So like doing it over 2 liters is gonna kind of wash some of that out?
Yeah. So essentially, my goal is to boost blood volume the best. And so I have to match it with the saltiness of my blood. Okay. Yeah. You're still going to be drinking water on the court, right? So you don't have to, if you're going to lose, let's say, a liter per hour, so you're going to lose 2 liters of fluid in those 2 hours, let's say, you don't have to get all of that water up front, but you do have to get all of the salt that you're about to lose up front. And you have to combine it in a way that's going to boost blood volume in a significant way. So you have to match it with the saltiness of your blood. You can get the other, let's say, liter lost back of water that you're going to lose by just drinking water during the match. It's much more important to sort of get the blood volume up first, and then you can deal with the extra water that's lost, on the court.
Got it. So what is the difference between different kinds of salt, right? Obviously, we hear a lot about sea salt. There's kind of pink Himalaya salt, the Redmond salt. So ReLyte's made by Redmond, which is a big, huge salt mining company that takes it from the salt flats in Utah.
Yes.
Are some salts better than others, or are we just all the same salt?
So there's not really the same salt. There's many different kinds, as you just kind of mentioned, but the key difference is a salt coming from a modern day ocean, or is a salt coming from a 65 million year old dried up ocean? Because one's going to have modern day pollution and microplastics and nanoplastics, and the other is not going to have that. So you have Redmond that's underground, that's 65 million years old, there's no access to modern day pollution. Whereas if you get sea salt from a current modern day ocean, that's going to have lots of microplastics in it. So to me, that's like the biggest difference when it comes to salts, but there's others that we can talk about.
Was there any research about microplastics having any impact on my pickleball game?
On your pickleball game, probably not acutely, but I mean, depending on the dose of microplastics that you're consuming over time, there's some data suggesting that it will affect hormone function. It can start messing up your receptors in regards to, let's say, insulin, thyroid health. So when it's sort of like the dose makes the poison, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, that's just going to depress me thinking about how our oceans
Well, I guess, so to your pickleball point, then there's salts that contain iodine and others that don't. We lose about 50 to 100 micrograms of iodine per hour of exercise through sweat. And so if you're constantly losing iodine through sweat and you're not getting it back through the diet, that can lead to hypothyroidism. And so that's going to lead to fatigue, decrease in energy, decrease in performance on the court. So Redmond does contain natural iodine. They don't add artificial iodide to it. So you'll see on the label, the FDA requires them to say this. Not a good source of iodide, but I don't want iodide. I want real iodine, and it contains, according to their own mineral analysis, 10 grams of their salt contains about 170 micrograms of iodine.
How would I measure all this stuff you're telling me? Like, how would I know if I'm losing iodine when I'm exercising? Because I definitely suffer from fatigue. Like, I know it. I get more tired, but I always have. That's kind of like a lifelong thing that I play hard and I get tired quickly. And how would I measure to see if it's some chemical imbalance? So
you don't have to measure if you're losing iodine through sweat. The salt fix, I dropped a few references on that, and the range, it's already been studied, it's already been looked at. Somewhere between 50 and 100 micrograms is what is lost per hour. Now, here's a problem with why measuring it doesn't really make a difference. And same with salt in your sweat. Yeah, it can, but I'll tell you why it's also kind of can be bad. Number one, if you're not losing it, let's say you're not losing a lot of salt in your sweat, you're not a heavy, like salty sweater, it could very much be because you were already depleted in salt. Okay? So a lot of people will say, oh, they'll get it tested. I'm not losing much salt. I must not need it. They, in fact, may actually need it more than the person who has a high concentration of salt. On the flip side, there are some people who are very high rate sweaters and very high salty sweaters, and they'll lose tremendous amounts of salt and they can quickly become depleted as well. So it's like, it can kind of lead to some false negatives if you have a low salt in your sweat and you're thinking you don't need a lot, but you might actually be depleted. And same thing with iodine. Let's say not a lot of iodine's coming out anymore, but could be because you don't have a lot in your body anymore because you've depleted it so much.
Right. That makes sense. And is that normal? Like when I use that analogy of when I was a kid, I used to taste the salt in my sweat, and then years went by without me tasting that. And now I feel like it's back, and I feel like it gave me like a fountain of youth almost. Like I felt like, oh my gosh, it was like this resurgence, this wave of nostalgia of being a kid, having energy, sweating it out, and feeling like maybe that's the right kind of healthy mix to have.
I think so. I think you're right. I think if you can taste it and it tastes nice and salty, I think you have decent salt status. You're going to feel better. The only downside to it is that if it gets in your eyes, it's going to sting a little bit, which is why, you know what I mean? You got people, that are wearing the bandanas and stuff like that to prevent it from getting in your eye. But that is kind of like a good taste test. If it doesn't taste very salty, you're probably deficient in salt.
I wonder how many people suffer from that. I mean, it wasn't a thing that I consciously thought of. It just went away, and therefore never really thought much about it until it came back. And then I was like, I just had this epiphany. Anyway, you've been in this business for a long time. You're an advocate of salt. What are some stories or anecdotes that you have that kind of prove out how different, having salt in your hydration process can enable you? Are there any athletes you've worked with or any stories that you have that kind of prove that out?
Yeah, I mean, I've worked with many athletes. Some of them, have millions and millions of followers, and I can't say who they are because I had to sign an NDA. That's how big they are. So let's just I can't say their names.
I will say their names. Okay. You just blink twice if I get it right. Michael Jordan, LeBron James.
I would love.
I'm just playing. Go ahead.
But yeah, some high profile UFC fighters, some high profile football players, some very high profile soccer players, tennis players. But anecdotally,
any pickleball players?
Yeah, like my neighbors. No one famous though in the pickleball realm.
All right.
But there's some good anecdotes in the salt fix too on certain athletes that their performance improved in triathlons and things like that. But one of the most emails I've ever gotten is actual atrial fibrillation. So a lot of people with AFib, probably a couple hundred emails I've received since the launch of the salt fix, that their AFib either went away or is much better after increasing their electrolyte intake, particularly salt. Obviously, muscle cramps and just energy too is one of the big ones that gets fixed with bumping up your electrolytes.
How do I start to add salt, sodium to my hydration process? Where do I start? What do I do?
I would say the most detailed would be my newest book. One of my newest books is Win, which is specifically targeting salt and hydration. So there's a chapter on that. It's about 50 pages, and it just goes through many, many different scenarios of how much salt you should be consuming and electrolytes per, X amount of fluid, and depending on which situation you're training for. I think that's really a good place to start, is those 50 pages in the book will make anyone a hydration expert if they read that.
Is there anything specific to pickleball that you've been thinking about? I know that pickleball is not on the top of your agenda, but is there anything that we can apply as pickleball players and fans and want to be better hydrated?
To be honest, it might be one of the most relevant sports when it comes to hydration, right? Because it's vigorous activity, it can last a long time, and it can happen in the heat. And so just like with tennis, I think a lot of people don't appreciate that you're playing these sports in a very, very hot temperature a lot of times. And so you don't typically think about tennis or pickleball is a sport that really should be focused. Hydration is priority number one. You think more of football players or something like that. But to be honest, tennis and pickleball, you may lose more salt than, you know, a typical athlete in that hour or two that you're playing.
Nice. All right. Dr. James.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Dinicolantonio.
There you
Did I
go.
get it right? All right.
Yeah.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you so much. Really appreciate the time. And I hopefully will get to chat with you again soon. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
All right. You got it.